Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
I'm not a pastor at all, but I'm just joining you because it's fun. And you can call me AJ.
Wonderful. And your pronouns?
She, her.
Great. Wonderful. In this episode, we'll discuss the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 17 or Proper 12, which this year falls on July 30th. We have a couple content notifications for this episode. We talk briefly about some anti-Semitic interpretations of scripture, specifically parables, when discussing the deep dive. And we talk about some biblical stories about rape during the first reading.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For this episode, as we dive deep into parables, we have with us special guest Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and the University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, Mary Jane Worthen, Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita, Professor of New Testament Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt University. AJ is an unorthodox member of an Orthodox synagogue whose biblical studies are dedicated to uprooting anti-Semitic and other readings that promote harm and hatred. Welcome! We are super excited to have you on our podcast.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks. Just listening to all those titles sounds like a little pretentious. I'm just a Bible scholar who's been around for a long time.
I was going to say, you have earned those titles, like particularly anything that is emerita. You have earned that.
It means you survived, right?
Yep, for sure. Yeah, so we're excited. A little bit of background for our listeners. This is like our biggest ask. And so like Kay and I were like, we're doing a deep dive into parables. And I was like, Short Stories by Jesus is my favorite book.
Absolutely.
And so then we were like, can we? And you said yes. And so we were very excited. I'm a little bit fan kidding, but I can get it under control, kind of, sort of. So,
but I didn't say yes until I actually listened to a couple of your other podcasts because I wanted to be sure what I was getting into. And I thought, no, they know what they're doing. This is interesting and well researched. So yeah, why not?
Thank you.
Well, yeah, we do try. And I'm glad that you gave us the shot. Yeah. So we're in the summer in the Revised Common Lectionary, which means lots of parables, especially for the Gospel of Matthew. And many people know, or maybe think we know, what a parable is when we see it in the Gospels. But trying to define or explain this makes a thing a parable is a bit more confusing maybe or difficult. So can you explain just what a parable is?
Well, all genres are fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And there are passages in the text that sometimes say, and Jesus told them a parable, and then you get, well, that doesn't sound like a parable.
Yeah.
So basically, it's a Greek term, para, which you know from things like parallel or paradox, means to set something side by side. Embalo means to cast or to throw. So ekbalo means to exercise, you cast out a demon. Parabalo means you cast two things next to each other. And in that comparison, you see something that's connected between the story world and your own life, whether personally or in terms of your family or your neighborhood or in terms of broader politics. So parables are supposed to help us think about who we are and what we're doing and what we're supposed to be doing. Jews at the time understood parables because there were a bunch of them that show up in the scriptures that Jews and Christians share, and what the church would call the Old Testament, or Jews would call the Tanakh. And they knew from Nathan's parable to David after the business with committing adultery with Bathsheba and arranging the death of her husband, which is not good politics, although kind of common. Nathan tells David this parable about a ewe lamb, and David realizes in this parable, well, that was a terrible thing. And Nathan says, well, you're the guy here.
Yeah.
The response to parables should not be, oh, what a nice little children's story, which is more or less how parables play out in churches today, because you can tell them to kids and kids can get a message out of them. Parables are designed to shake us up a little bit or tell us something that we know but we don't want to acknowledge. It's kind of like a good form of heart surgery where they bring stuff to the surface that needs to be dealt with. So the general view is if you hear a parable and you think, isn't that lovely, or I think that's terrific, it's a reading that works for you, but you're probably miscuing how it would have fit Jesus' original audience. And generally, if somebody hurls a parable directly at you, run. Invited. So in listening to the parables, we do well to be open to the challenge, be open to the critique, to be open to a new way of seeing things.
Sure. Yeah. So since we already brought up Jesus, how does Jesus use parables? Is there anything about Jesus's use of parables that sort of sets him apart, or is he very much in line with the use of parables in general?
Oh, he's pretty much in line. He doesn't have any animal stories, which I think is kind of weird, because rabbinic parables, post-biblical Jewish parables, have lots of animal stories. And we might think of parables as on that same sort of generic stratum as Aesop's fables, like, the tortoise and the hare, or the fox with the sour grapes, which are also, they can work for kids, but they're also pretty good adult stories too, because the morals typically work well. Jesus' parables generally come without explanation. Rabbinic parables often do. Biblical parables in the shared scriptures often do, and Aesop's fables usually do. And I think this is part of Jesus' genius, is he's just like, I don't have to unpack all this stuff for you. Go work on it. Parables and stories become an opportunity for people to talk with each other. So Jesus tells a parable, and I can picture, Peter looking at Andrew going, what do you get out of this? Let's talk to one of the Marys. They're all named Mary. We'll talk to one of the Marys, see what we get out of it. And that means, because they frequently come without explanation, that as you look at the past 2,000 years of church history, we have multiple interpretations of parables. They're always open. In Mark, in chapter 4, which Matthew picks up in chapter 13, Mark tells us that Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables as best as they could understand this stuff. And then he explained everything in private to his disciples. But if you look at the disciples in Mark, they're really not the sharpest knives in the drawer.
They're like the worst. They just get worse as the gospel goes along.
Right. After Jesus feeds 5,000 people with limited resources, and a couple of chapters later feeds another 4,000 people, he gets into the boat with the guys, and he says, watch out for the leaven, the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians. He's speaking in metaphoric terms. That's like a parable. And the disciples look at each other and says, he's upset because we forgot to bring bread, which is clearly not his problem, because he can eat. So the very idea that these explanations were told to the disciples, but we don't have them, is probably a good thing. That's that invitation to us.
Oh no, people may have to talk about their faith and think about it. Whatever will we do?
What a concept.
Yeah. And I think a couple weeks ago we had in Matthew, I don't remember which passage it was exactly, but we had it where Jesus tells the story of the seeds scattered, the sower who scatters the seeds everywhere, and some is on the road, some is on the rocks, and all of this stuff. And then afterwards it comes back in, and according to Matthew, Jesus explains it and says, this is what each of these things mean, which provides a very clear and easy and non-challenging explanation for it. But I think what we talked about on the podcast was a lot of that is a later addition, is like Matthew trying to get a particular point across to the community that he is addressing with this.
Right, and the allegory in Matthew is inconsistent.
Yeah.
So is the seed the word? Is the seed the person who hears the word?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of depends upon how you feel at the moment you're reading it. Yeah. And that's the benefit about parables, is they can open up to multiple interpretations. So that even the allegory being inconsistent, you can come in and then go, well, but what about this? And but what about that? And that keeps the text new and fresh and open to multiple meanings. I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So you've already mentioned that Jesus was not the first to use parables, and we have the example of Nathan talking to David. Are there other examples of parables, either in the Tanakh or kind of more broadly in ancient times, that you're like, these are either that Jesus maybe jumped off of and retold, or other ones that were around before Jesus?
Parables in the sense of stories that help us make a connection between the story world and our own world are cross-cultural. This is not something Jesus invented. You can find them in Native American traditions. You can find them in Buddhist traditions. You can find them in Greco-Roman paganism and so on, because that's what stories do. Because if the story has no connection to our world at all, then we've got no purchase on the story and we're going to walk away because there's no way of entering the story or figuring out where are we in the story or even with whom might we identify or who's the good guy and the bad guy. So parables are in that sense a form of storytelling. I think parents do this all the, let me tell you a story about what's going to happen if you don't clean your room or do your homework. A story about what will happen if you actually do write to grandma and grandpa and say thank you for the birthday gift. So parables function along these lines. The edginess is greater in some traditions than in others. And it's certainly pretty great within the Jewish tradition, which tends to be fairly edgy, which is why we have prophets of Israel telling people, get with the program. And then we preserve this stuff and continue to read it. So what we're dealing with here is a very self-critical tradition that says, let's acknowledge our problems rather than, let's
try and hide them
and not deal with it.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful parable. The Hebrew term would be mashal. In the book of Judges, I think it's in chapter 9, which deals with it's the desire of the trees. So it's an allegory for human beings who want to be like all the other nations. They want a king to rule over them. And they got to find somebody to be a ruler. And they go up to any tree that's worth anything, like the oak and the elm and the cypress. And they're all fabulous trees. But they've got day jobs, so they don't want to be king. And finally, they go up to the bramble, who's good for absolutely nothing else, and says, hey, bramble, rule over us. And so what you ask for out of desperation is what you get, and it's really, really bad. And the parable is designed to talk about an incompetent and quite evil ruler.
Sure.
That's true.
Interesting. I have not read Judges in a while.
Judges is a very difficult book, but there are kind of some funny things.
Yeah. I think Judges and Numbers I think of as there are some hidden gems in there that we don't give those books enough credit for, the hidden stories that are
Well, since you're on the lectionary, because you're talking about what the reading is for a particular Sunday, I don't think the book of Numbers shows up in the Revised Common Lectionary for Sunday reading.
It does maybe once, but not often. And at the end of this season, we will have done an entire Revised Common Lectionary. And so then we're looking at changing our formatting a little bit to get at more of the passages that don't show up that people are less familiar with. So,
Good.
Numbers.
So when you read and teach about parables, how do you approach them? Like if someone puts a new parable in front of you, where do you start?
With any sort of biblical reading, the best way of proceeding, whether you're dealing with professional Bible scholars or you're dealing with people in a congregation who suddenly work up the courage to say, I think I'm going to do this on my own, is to ask the individual, what does this text mean to me? As opposed to what does it mean? Because if you say, what does it mean? Then there's a right answer and a wrong answer. Or here's what it means historically, or here's what Thomas Aquinas said about it, or here's what Klein Snodgrass in his commentary said about it. We don't need to do that. But if you say, what does this text mean to me? You can't get it wrong because it means something to you. So if you begin with this positive, you can't get it wrong. That's good. The other positive along these lines is you can never be fully right. Because no matter what you come up with, somebody else is going to come up with something different. Because whenever we read a text, we bring to it our own life experiences or other books that we've read or what our interests are or what we had for breakfast, whatever it is that we bring to the text. So all of our readings are necessarily limited. They're necessarily tangential, but you can also get something there. What I like to do in the classroom is to have people say, here's what the text means to me. Or if they don't want to go that way, or sometimes texts just don't mean anything, they don't get any purchase. Say, well, here's what I read, or here's what I've heard. And then we can have this conversation. Well, what about this? And what about that? And if you put this text in comparison with that text, what do you see that you have not seen before? Which is a good parable thing to do. You put two things next to each other. And in that juxtaposition, you see new things. So if you put something like the parable of the sower and with the seed and all that other stuff up against other parables that deal with seeds or other parables that deal with plants, of which there are a bunch of them, then you can start getting new meanings accordingly. And the idea for my students and for me is not to just repeat what people have said over the past 2,000 years, but come up with a reading that's new, that's credible. By credible, it has to make sense to somebody other than just you personally.
Yeah.
Right. And that also has some sort of cash out. Because what I want my students to do is answer the question of how do you know that? So you're not just talking off the top of your head. How do you know that? Where's your evidence? And so what? Why does anybody care? So for church concerns or synagogue concerns, or if you're interpreting the Quran for mosque concerns, that why would anybody care is really important. Because if you've got something that means something to you, but it doesn't mean anything to anybody else, that's good for you, right? Terrific. I'm delighted for you. But I would much prefer that some sort of community be built up in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. The congregation that I most recently served, sometimes I would be like, okay, and now I'm going to get nerdy on you and let's look at the Greek in this particular context or something, because it is translated in a particular way. And then it's like, but what if this? Like, what if we didn't translate it right? Which happens all the time. Yeah.
So, I mean, but see, how would you know?
Yep.
And that's the problem with translation. So you might have an accurate translation, but it could be misleading. You could have a paraphrase that could be a better sense. You could have a translation that might not have made any sense to Paul or to Matthew, but makes abundant amount of sense to us today.
Yeah.
So there's an old Italian proverb that says all translators are traitors, which I just kind of messed up because so we're always going to lose something in the translation, and we're also going to gain something because words come with different connotations. I find it helpful in my synagogue when my rabbi points out, well, the Hebrew here could also mean this, or the same word is used elsewhere where we could translate it differently. And now I have two things that I can start looking at in terms of a pair that I hadn't thought about before. And I find in churches, because I'm in churches a lot, when whoever's giving the sermon says, well, actually the Greek says, oh, thank God you paid attention when you went to school and you know something more than most of the people in the congregation know. And that's in part why they're paying you, although they're not paying you much. Use that education. That's a good thing.
Yeah. And that's like, I think that's what people want, right? And that's part of what I'm hearing you say, both in terms of your like engagement in your own synagogue, and then also like so much of what we do as a podcast, and part of why we're doing what we're doing, is lay people who are not theologically educated want to dig deep. And part of what clergy have been remiss in is that we have shied away from really digging into texts because we're anxious about job security and we're anxious about offending people. And then we get parables and it's like, no, the point of this is to provoke and to make people think and make people dig deeper.
Yeah.
It's like thinking about people in churches as sheep, right? And you don't want to be offensive to sheep. You just want to tell them where to go and not prod them too much and then collect money from them, as opposed to treating them like people.
Right? Yeah.
Right? You get nowhere. Treat them like people, not like sheep.
So many pastors are like, like think of themselves as shepherds. We have like bishops who have like the shepherd's crook as like a symbol. And I'm like, you don't change species when you're ordained. So if you're calling all of the lay people sheep, you don't become a sheepdog and you don't become the good shepherd. We've got one of those when you're ordained. You are still a sheep if you were a sheep then. And also, it's a metaphor. So nobody's actually a sheep, but like
we're sheep with better clothing.
I've been having flashbacks this whole conversation to a Bible study I led once on Revelation, and having to very slowly climb up the giant hill of actually it's okay to not have one perfect answer of exactly what this text means. And also, this is Revelation, so we will never have one perfect answer to what this text means. That hill took so long to climb, and some of the people in that Bible study who were lay members of the congregation I was working at were afraid to climb it because they thought they were doing something wrong, and that was one of the saddest things I ever had to deal with, because the idea that there's one perfect answer to everything in Scripture is not a math problem. You can't compare it to that, and treating it that way ruins so much of the layered meanings and the nuances available to us.
Well, it's also doing two things that I think are unhelpful. First of all, it's restricting meaning to what it would have meant in its original context, which means we all now have to play first century Bible land or middle Iron Age Bible land or late Bronze Age Bible land. And that's not terribly helpful if you live in 2023 or thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, from a Christian discursive perspective, it's putting the Holy Spirit out of business. It's saying it's nothing new to teach. And for a third and more minor point, it puts all clergy out of business, because if the thing only has one reading, why do you need clergy? You can just go look up that one reading website and that gets you going for the day. So why bother?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason why we're talking about parables at all is that one of the texts that we're reading for this episode is Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33 and verses 44 through 52, in which Jesus throws a whole bunch of very short parables at his disciples and the crowd, and then does not explain any of them. And For the most part, as I read those parables, I get a very strong feeling of put all your eggs in one basket sense to the kingdom of God with several of these. But can you tell us more about what these particular parables are driving at?
I can, but it might be helpful if you actually let your auditors know what the parables say, and we can go them one by one.
Yes.
So the first one is the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field, and is the smallest of all the seeds. But when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.
Right. So technically it's wrong. The mustard seed is not the smallest of seeds. Orchid seeds are smaller. Right. So I have to look this up.
Sure.
I was going to say, I looked that up at one point too, because
Right. I know very little about horticulture. The very idea of gardening is like in your knees in the dust and the dirt with the bugs. I'm just happy to like plant flowers. It shows up in Matthew, it shows up in Mark, it shows up in Luke, and each time it's a little bit different. Mm-hmm. This doesn't disturb me very much. I think Jesus is a good storyteller, might have changed the words on occasion, just as any good storyteller does, because you adapt to your audience. Shrubs don't grow into giant trees, neither does mustard seed, and certainly not giant trees in which the birds of heaven nest in their branches. So the whole thing's a little bit weird. Then you get into the commentaries, and the commentaries take it in all sorts of bizarre directions. So a number of commentaries that say that, mustard is unclean. It's not, because otherwise how could Jews have hot dogs with mustard? I mean, that would be just... Or that it's a weed and it's toxic, which is actually not. It's actually quite medicinal. It was also used for ornamentation. They want to come up with Jesus is giving us the sense of impurity of the kingdom. Well, that's just total nonsense. Could the birds of the heaven represent the Gentile nations? Because you have models like that show up in the scriptures of Israel, like in Ezekiel. It's possible. But I don't think we need an allegory to go there. Mm-hmm. So what we have is something that's totally unexpected. Right? Mustard seeds do not grow into giant trees. So there's something a little bit weird here. Now, let's talk about what we do with that weirdness rather than try to dismiss it. That I find to be helpful. That anything that starts small can become great. Well, yes, but that's kind of obvious and not much of a challenge. But a mustard seed? I mean, who'd have thought? Or maybe, depending upon our own subject position or our social location, we might think, well, maybe I'm nothing. I'm just some person, or I'm a little person, or I'm a child, and I don't think I'm going to amount to much. And boy, you can grow into this giant thing too, because strange things happen. Or watch what happens in terms of nature not working the way we expect it to. And then we can bring in Paul's comment about wild olive shoots grafted contrary to nature onto this olive shoot, and that's what gives Gentile their salvation. So something here contrary to nature could actually be fabulous. I expect some of your listeners would know some other allusions going along with that particular line. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do with here in terms of play, but it's like really serious play. It's fun, and at the same time, it's profound. So go back and look at where else mustard seed shows up. There are lots of good rabbinic examples where mustard seed shows up and functioning in a variety of different ways, some of which quite human and biological, and some of which dealing with plants, and some of which dealing with metaphors. And you can talk about trees, and is the great tree the big thing that we're concerned about, or maybe this tiny little plant that might do something? This is all wonderful. And I think it's good that we don't have an explanation for it, and we don't have a singular version of it. But then we go play.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's what makes Bible study fun. And it's how in Bible study you get to know more about yourself and more about your neighbors who come up with different translations. And for those people who have a theological bent, a little bit more about God.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So verse 33 is the parable. The kingdom of the reign of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. And I am not a baker. I have occasionally baked bread, but that is not my forte. And 3 measures is not, like, in my mind, 3 measures is like 3 cups, right?
It's about 60 pounds.
Yeah, that's not 3 cups. And so, like, this one in particular, I think, when I read Short Stories by Jesus, your book, that was my, like, mind blown. Like, oh, this is a totally different thing than what I was thinking. Because it never made a lot of sense. Because I was like, okay, yeast helps bread.
Yeah, it actually means it's sourdough starter.
Yeah.
That's the type of yeast. It's not like those little red star things you keep in your refrigerator door and think that at some point you might actually bake. The text also doesn't say mixed in, it says hid. The Greek is a crypto. We get words like cryptogram or cryptology. So I don't bake either. I don't garden. I don't bake. I'm a total domestic disaster. Back to Mount Sinai, the women in my family, we're terrible in the kitchen. So if when you bake or when you knead, right, yeast and dough, you don't hide it. You mix it. So the English translation says, well, this is what you do, but it's overriding the Greek, which is the wrong word. There are also different versions of this parable, including one in the non-canonical text called the Gospel According to Thomas, in which the kingdom of the Father is like a woman who took, as opposed to like leaven that a woman took. And then you can wonder, well, if the word yeast is foregrounded, I get one message. If the word woman is foregrounded, I get a different message. I mean, at the end, you wind up with a big batch of bread, but there's a different emphasis there. And then we could start worrying about that until all of it is leavened. And now I've got a connection with my mustard seed. Because for both planting and bread baking, there comes a point where you got to leave something alone. If you keep messing with the seed's not going to germinate. If you overwater it, it's not going to germinate. If you keep messing with the bread dough after you've done the kneading and you put it aside, then it's not going to rise and you're not going to get bread. You're just going to get a brick of something inedible. So now when I put these two parables next to each other, which Matthew conveniently has done for me, I can say, well, what does this tell us about leaving stuff alone and letting nature take its course and letting things be as somehow their nature allows them to be, rather than my coming in and interfering. So I can get the process started, but then you let nature take its course. And then, now I've got, here's how you raise children. And here's how you do with the congregation. You plant the seeds or you get the bread going, but then you got to leave them alone to figure out what their own path is going to be. And with that anticipation of this enormous yield. So again, there's so much you can do with this stuff as opposed to start small and gets big. Yeah, we got that. We can do a whole lot more. Yeah. And we can be amused in the process. I think at the end of this parable of the leaven or the parable about the woman who hides dough, because again, what we call parables is going to skew the interpretation. Do we talk about the parable of the mustard seed, or we talk about the parable of the bird's nest, or we talk about the guy who sowed the seed? Do we talk about the leaven? Do we talk about the women? Do we talk about enough bread to feed an entire village at the end? And that moves me to Eucharistic language, and it moves me to manna in the wilderness, and it moves me to the Jewish blessing before we eat food with bread products, which is pretty much everything. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. The Hebrew is hamotzi lechem min haaretz. I think, well, wait a minute. God doesn't bring forth bread. God brings forth grain. Now, how did I get from the grain to the bread? And now I got to think about, where did the grain come from in the first place? So this woman has dough. Where did she get the grain? Let me go back to the mustard seed guy, or the sower who went out to sow. Who planted it? Who harvested it? Who milled it? Where's the human connection here? The parable is all that stuff too. I learned this from people who bake bread, because again, I know nothing about baking bread.
Our first season was when we had the John, I am the bread of life. That I think it was 5 weeks of Jesus talking about being the bread of life. And we did a whole series, and we did a Jesus Loafs You series. And we had a whole bunch of different guests who actually were bakers and talked about bread and cooking and baking and stuff.
Right. Or since we're dealing with something that looks like sourdough starter, I do have friends who do bake, and their sourdough starter is precious.
Yeah,
they take care of it and they have nurtured it. And in some cases, this thing is 50 years old, and they got it from their mother, who got it from her mother, and so on, in this sense of what's coming into this bread, which is not just this little bit of leaven, but years or generations of history. So it's something old, and it's also something new. That's helpful. So even so you taste something, whose recipe are you using? Who taught the person who prepared the food how to prepare the food? Where did it come from? Or if you want to go to John's Bread of Life discourse, that's John chapter 6. I mean, John doesn't know where to end a chapter. They just go on forever. So I can understand why you would spend 5-6 weeks on this. Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no part of me. Well, that's a full hour right there. But where else does bread show up? So the multiple feedings. Or turn these stones into bread at the temptation, which only Matthew and Luke have. Mark doesn't. Or dining with sinners and tax collectors, or having meals with Pharisees, and what's on the table. And do you need something really rich or fancy, or is the kingdom of God just present when everybody has a piece of bread? How fabulous is that? or the give us tomorrow's bread today, which is probably the better translation of the Our Father prayer. Bring about that messianic banquet. Or feed me because I'm hungry, and I know that if I go to this particular house, somebody will have bread that they will be able to share with me. There's so much you can do with this stuff. And if you get lunch after, even better.
Yep. So the next parable is the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field.
Yeah, so the first question is it legal? And the second question is it moral? So I actually talked to some lawyers about this. Yeah, it is entirely legal, right? So if you have a hunch that there's oil underneath this field, do you have to tell the owner? No. Right? And then where did the treasure come from? And how far back does it go? And why did somebody bury it there in the first place? Are they refugees who are hoping to come back and then were unable to do so? Are they rich people who are worried about thieves coming in? And Jesus has a bunch of parables about like the thief in the night, or just thieves. Don't lay up treasure where moth and rust can get at it. That means don't bury it. Lay up treasure in heaven, which is basically do good deeds to replenish those heavenly treasure boxes up there. When do we bury our treasures? I mean, is sticking it in the bank a type of buried treasure? You use it and distribute it and play with all the other parables dealing with money, like the parable of the talents. The talents is just a big chunk of change, huge chunk of change. You put all those together, or the parable of the dishonest steward who cooks the books and winds up getting hailed by the landowner saying, well done. So again, these parables open up to multiple interpretations. Is this put all your eggs in one basket? Yeah, kind of, but at least you get some money at the end. Putting all your eggs in one basket, if we're talking about the parable of what's usually called the pearl of great price, at the end, all you got is a pearl. And I'm not sure what you can do with that. So even there, you have to start worrying about what is the result I want from this? And the thing with parables generally is that once you think you've got it, you've cracked it, you've got it, I think this is what the parable does. There's this little thread. I do knit. So there's this little thread that you start pulling and then the whole thing comes unraveled and you got to go back and do it again.
Yeah. Reminds me of the line from the musical Hello, Dolly. Money is like manure. It's not any good to anybody unless you spread it around a little.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the pearl of great price, that is the next parable in this passage. Is the reign of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, they went and sold all that they had and bought it.
Yeah, so that's already a problem, because at the point where the merchant finds his pearl, the merchant is no longer a merchant. He's a guy with a pearl. Yeah. He was looking for multiple pearls. He's just got one. He went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, so I got a problem here because I take that all quite seriously. So it's his home, and it's his clothing, and it's his wife and his children, because you could do that in antiquity. And now he's got a pearl. And what's he going to do with the pearl? So I'm just trying to picture this in terms of like the neighbors. Hey, Florence, it's the guy with the pearl. Tell him we're not home. Right? I mean, and then we start going to the interpretations. It's, oh, no, the pearl is. And then you start getting multiple interpretations of what the pearl is. The pearl is the kingdom of heaven. Well, I already knew that. So that's telling me X equals X. That's not helpful. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl. Okay, fine. Thanks very much. Kingdom of heaven is like good jewelry. Don't think so. Because I don't think the kingdom of heaven or the realm of heaven, whatever you want to call it, is a commodity. I don't think you purchase it. I don't think it's on the market. Among teenagers, when I was working on my parables book, among teenagers, one of the favorite interpretations was the pearl of great price is me. I am so important that the merchant, who now turns out to be Jesus, who sells all that he has, so he goes to the cross, he gives his life up for me. And the message of the parable is, look at how important I am, which may be helpful if you're feeling depressed or you're feeling that you're not worthy. But on the other hand, if the end result is, look at how important I am, that might not be terribly helpful to somebody who's already a CEO or somebody who's a multimillionaire. Right? So one reading that might work for a hurting adolescent is absolutely the wrong reading for a not so hurting CEO. Are we to be the merchant? Are we supposed to be the pearl? What about the other jewels? Do they count for anything? What about the wife and the kids? So I worry about that because most people were married in antiquity. What's all this stuff that he sold? Does that go back on the marketplace? Or the practical interpretations? Oh, he'll sell the pearl on the retail market and he'll make a great profit, which again turns the kingdom of heaven into a commodity. And I don't think that's terribly helpful.
Yeah.
So there are certain readings that I do want to resist.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that one in particular is because the I am the pearl like resonates with me as a queer person and someone who has frequently felt unvalued in the church and in the world. And also the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant, right? Like, so even in that, the actual, like the focus point, like you were talking about with the woman in the yeast, it's the merchant and what the merchant is up to.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like the pearl. And
sure, unless you make the merchant Jesus, in which case you're fine.
Yeah.
So, and once you put on an allegorical interpretation, I mean, that's a possible reading. It's not the definitive reading, but it's certainly a possible.
Yeah.
And it's not one that hasn't been cited by the church fathers and so on, going all the way back. So there will be multiple readings. And what Jesus, assuming Jesus told this parable, I don't know. It could have come from, the oral tradition. What Jesus might have intended might not have been the same thing as what Matthew might have intended, might not have been the same thing as what the people across the centuries have intended. It doesn't make your reading wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because the cool thing here is we can't get back to the authorial intent. I wrote my dissertation on the Gospel of Matthew back when Noah was still on the ark. It's a very, very long time ago. And I will have these conversations with Matthew to say, Matthew, did you intend something? And Matthew's response, because Matthew talks to me, is, yeah, I can see where you get it. Which is not the answer that I want, but at least it's moderately satisfying. Okay, this reading makes some sense. Mm-hmm. Even though it's not part of the authorial intent. And the thing is, I don't know what the authorial intent is, and I can't get back to it.
Yeah, that's in a lot of fandom, right? It's the author is dead. Mm-hmm. We cannot hear from the author again. Or I know in some fandoms, it's the author is dead. No matter what they say that's terrible, that is no longer the authority because it's not in the text.
But even if the author were not dead, it's still not the authority. So I'm an author. And when people write to me, and they do, and they say, well, did you intend blah, blah? It's like, no. So I know what the authorial intent is because I'm the author. But on the other hand, I can see where you get it.
Yeah.
And that becomes helpful. I think clergy have this fairly often. So you give a sermon, and then you have the meet and greet at the end. And the congregant says, oh, I loved what you said about something or other. And you think, thank you. You said nothing about that. At that point, you take credit for it. Or I really didn't like what you said about blah, blah, blah. And so, oh, well, thank you. Let me reconsider that. As opposed to, oh, I didn't say anything about that.
Yeah. And then the last parable that Jesus tells, it sort of seems like he does give a bit of an explanation for it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Oh, isn't that charming?
Yeah.
Right.
So cheerful.
Right. It's part of Matthew, because when you compare material in Matthew to material in Mark, and most biblical scholars think that Mark wrote first and then Matthew used Mark as a source, Matthew tends to ratchet up the end of the world pain, horror, gnashing of teeth, weeping, wailing stuff. Mm-hmm. So Matthew's really into wailing and gnashing of teeth, which sounds to me like a dentist office without Novocaine.
Yeah.
So this is not surprising. Matthew is very interested in you have to do the right thing, because if you don't do the right thing, by the time the end comes and you haven't done the right thing, at some point, this final judgment will come about, and you better get your act together before that time comes, because you don't know when it's coming. So the parable of the dragnet toward the end of Matthew 13 is consistent with Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, to which I have to tell my Jewish friends, if you get into heaven and there's a sheep line and a goat line, just get into the sheep line and hope for the best. Because Matthew's really interested in people who are followers of Jesus actually doing something, rather than, as Matthew puts it, it's not those who say, Lord, Lord. And now we have all this agricultural metaphoric stuff. You have to bear good fruit, and you have to yield good grain, and you have to be attentive to people who are hungry or thirsty or who are imprisoned, and so on. And if you don't do that, it's really bad news at that final harvest. Matthew's not kidding. I think Jesus probably thought something along the same way. I don't think it means you burn forever and ever and ever in the sense of Dante's hell. This business about things like unquenchable fire and all that. The Greek term is asbestos. It's the fire that keeps burning. It's not you, your flesh. You just burn up. You go into oblivion, as opposed to the sheep who have like nice places in the kingdom of heaven.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, and that's really helpful, because I was actually really glad that we had one of the parables with there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth in the furnace of fire and stuff, because that is a scary thing, and it is so frequently associated with a Dante's Inferno kind of hell that for people, just because of like pop culture Christianity and I'm always
it was already there. And when you start getting commentaries on heaven and hell in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, and you have people who have it, like Virgil has a tour of hell. Well, earlier than that, there were other people who take tours of heaven and hell. And when they go to hell, they see all sorts of people being tortured. And it's like, let the punishment fit the crime from the Mikado. So women who are adulterous or have particular forms of their bodies which are sexualized, being tortured, and so on. So it's already there. So the more the church talked about heaven and hell, and heaven was great, it's actually the early versions of heaven striking is kind of boring. I mean, you just sit there and contemplate God, but apparently you're happy doing this. And then hell is much more active and much more painful. The more the church talked about heaven and hell, the more the Jewish community said, let them worry about that. We're just going to worry about how do we sanctify daily life rather than this salvation and damnation. So Judaism doesn't have a real strong ongoing sense of hell, or, we're bound in the bonds of eternity. And there's a sense in conservative and Orthodox Judaism of a general resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about that because we're just supposed to be good people anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the parables in the Gospels, as we've talked about, have been interpreted and are still interpreted in a lot of different ways. And also, not all of those ways are harmless. So what are some of the ways that people have maybe understood some parables or parables kind of as a trend, I guess, that have caused harm?
I'll give you a couple of examples. Thank you for the question. And with the parable of the mustard seed, and especially the parable of the leaven, the parable of the yeast, the idea that these represent impurity and Jesus is celebrating impurity and thereby doing away with Jewish purity laws. This is totally wrong. Even when Jesus deals with people in states of ritual impurity, like a corpse, because a corpse is really impure, or somebody with a skin disease, translated leprosy, but it's a skin disease, or a lady with hemorrhages, probably vaginal or uterine, they're in states of ritual impurity. What Jesus does is restore them to purity rather than do away with purity laws. And there's no law against touching this. Yeast is not a symbol entirely of impurity because Jews are eating yeast products for 53 out of 54 weeks a year. And the showbread in the temple is made with yeast. So yeast is actually used in some forms of sacrificial material. So now we have to worry about how the metaphor functions. So that's, if you have to have a negative view of Judaism in order for the parable to work, it's probably not a good reading. And it's a reading that will lead toward anti-Semitism, and I don't find that to be particularly helpful. Purity laws similarly come into the parable of the Good Samaritan. The reason some people argue that the priest and Levite walk by the traveler in the ditch is because they're afraid if he's dead and they touch him, or if they die, or if he dies while they're attending him, then they will become corpse impure. So the reason they avoid the guy in the ditch is because they're worried about purity laws. And the parable says absolutely nothing about that. It's a bad reading. Parable of the prodigal son, that the idea of the loving father would have been staggering to first century Jews who thought of an Old Testament God of wrath, and would have been stunned by the idea of divine mercy, which is just nonsense. So again, it's making Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. Pretty much today, when I read sermons or articles about Jesus being radical, usually the radicality is a misconstrue of early Judaism. I was reading actually a sermon this morning about a fellow who said it was radical of Jesus to talk about make sure that your heart is inclined to what you do, Sermon on the Mount, right? It's not just what you do, but it's what you think. It's not just don't commit murder, but don't be angry. It's not don't commit adultery, but don't be lustful. And the sermon said, well, because Jesus radically invented this idea of interiority. And so I write to the author, because I do that when I see sermons that are bad, and I say, excuse me, Jews did have a notion of interiority. Here's how Jewish prayers begin about the inclination of my heart. Jews understood what hypocrisy was. They didn't like it either. So don't make Jesus this radical over against Judaism. If you want to make him radical, say things like he's the one who says you have to hate your father and mother and your kids. That's pretty radical. He's the one who says sell all you have and give to the poor, and he doesn't say that to everybody.
Yeah,
right. That's pretty radical. But don't overread. So one of the things that I try to do in my scholarship is to show how Jesus can be profound and interesting and edgy without having to front load a negative view of Judaism in order to have him do this. I mean, I'm not a worshiper of Jesus, but I think he's fabulous. And if I think he can be fabulous, and I'm not even in the system, and I don't need to make Judaism look bad in order to have that, then I think that my Christian friends should be able to do the same.
Yeah. And that I think one of my things that I want to say a pet peeve, but it feels like more than just like a little pet peeve, is the Old Testament wrathful God and like the way that it's characterized. And I've noticed it happening with comedians most, because I'm really clear, like when I talk about it, and if I'm having a conversation, like I'll address it if somebody talks about like the wrathful God, and I'm like, okay, but Jesus said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And like, and to kind of pick apart how that is, right? That the Jewish 10 commandments, the like first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's not a like wrath and rules and like, right? Like that is a liberative God. But it's such a default for people who are culturally Christian, whether or not they actually continue to worship in a Christian context, continue to like identify as a Christian, like any of that, that automatically we assume everything that is the Tanakh, that is Jewish, that is Old Testament, is wrath and punishment, and everything that is the Gospels and New Testament is grace and love. And it's like, A, false binary, and B, not accurate.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I get that nonsense from my students, I just proof text. Right. So the Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. But you are condemned to the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. Right. So I have a good shepherd. You have a sadistic dentist. Fine. So what needs to be done then in order to prevent this negative language? And we've been able to correct language when it comes to other minoritized and oppressed groups. Is don't use this term, use that term. Or if you do use this term, here's how you use it. Mm-hmm. So that when you start hearing somebody say Old Testament God of wrath, it's just right. So, excuse me, I am a pastor and I find this offensive. Yeah. In the same way that I'm writing to people who are giving sermons saying, excuse me, I find this offensive. I also find it historically inaccurate and theologically vapid. Then you have to tell them what vapid means. But so instead of just saying, I don't like this, then to go do something about it. Mm-hmm. So why does this matter? Because you can actually do something about it. And you can, to some extent, correct these horrible stereotypes that are there.
Yeah. Because it turns out that if you're trying to teach about a Jewish guy from 2,000 years ago and you don't know much about Judaism or about Judaism 2,000 years ago, it's going to be kind of hard to be at all accurate about any of it.
Right. So that also raises the question about what are you going to call that interior scripture? Because if you just call it the Jewish Bible, it's inaccurate for a bunch of reasons. It's also part of the Christian Bible. And Judaism is less based on the text than on the commentaries on the text. Mm-hmm. So what did Second Temple Jews do with some of those problematic verses? What did Rabbinic Judaism? Because otherwise Judaism winds up becoming, done at the Old Testament, and then you have Christianity coming in as being the future religion. So even our language is a bit of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we use a variety of different terms, because Hebrew scriptures also isn't completely accurate because it's not all in Hebrew, and the translations that we have, not all. And yeah. So I think I try to use the Tanakh when I'm talking about something that is the Tanakh.
But that's not the canon of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Because it's a different canonical order with a different reception history. Yeah. I'm happy with the term Old Testament. When I was in graduate school, again, many, many years ago, my professors told me not to use the term Old Testament because Jews didn't like it. And I was thinking, well, it wasn't a problem for me, but what if I know? So I was on Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Scriptures bandwagon for a while. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that's not helpful. Because what Hebrew Bible does is attempt to erase distinctions between the Tanakh and the Old Testament. So if somebody says Old Testament, then I know I'm talking about Christian Bible Part 1. And you can fuss about whether we're talking about the Old Testament of the Anglican, Catholic, and Orthodox communions, or whether we're talking about the Old Testament of the Protestant communions because they have different books. Mm-hmm. And because I'm old, my sense is if people use the term Old Testament but think about it as the one with all the good animal stories.
Yeah.
The one with all the built-up wisdom.
Yeah, all that. The one with the best love poetry ever.
The butterscotch in their purse.
Mm-hmm. Then also, as long as people realize that old means foundational and bedrock and worth hanging on to because you can't function without it, and something to be honored and cherished, then I'm perfectly happy with the term Old Testament, because we're going to use New Testament anyway.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about the Bible of the synagogue, then use Tanakh. And now I don't have to have some default which says we're really reading the same text when we're not, because that winds up being a kind of Christian colonialism, unintended, but that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that's like, we did a deep dive the other week into Jeremiah. And part of what we were looking at in Jeremiah is that it is organized differently in the Tanakh than in the Christian Old Testament.
Yeah.
There's like one section that I think is like flip-flopped or something.
Yeah, and the Septuagint is quite different.
Yeah, and so then like, which one is older? And is that mean it's better? Or is that just like they developed differently and so how we understand them is different? And yeah. Those are some ways that have been more harmful in interpreting parables and just like talking about scripture. Are there some interpretations that, or like patterns of interpretation that are more faithful or more liberating?
That would depend upon the individual doing the reading. And you also have to worry about faithful to what? Faithful to historical critical intent, faithful to the needs of the congregation at the moment the text is being read, faithful to the individual who needs a particular message at a particular time. So as soon as you say faithful, I need to know faithful in terms of what? There are different ways of being faithful to a text or respectful of its author. I think another faithful reading from an interior perspective is sometimes to fight with the text. So if you come up with a text that you just don't like, then go argue with it. And I think that's a faithful reading, which is why we have books like Job, or Abraham arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, or Jeremiah arguing with God about pretty much everything, because Jeremiah is not happy with the way things are going.
Yeah.
There's a whole tradition of being able to argue with God, which is traditionally what the term Israel means anyway, to wrestle with God. So I think a faithful reading is sometimes arguing against the text, because that's being faithful to the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would do that with passages in Leviticus 18 and 20, or Romans 1, or 1 Corinthians 9, and so on. That's a faithful reading.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So then, in the Jesus sense, what are your favorite or least favorite parables from Jesus?
My least favorite parables, or at least the ones with which I struggle the most, I'm not sure least favorite is fine, is those parables in Matthew that end with all sorts of ick at the end. I just finished up another big Jesus book, and I have a chapter on parables regarding slavery, where slaves are flayed and chopped in two and beaten and terrorized. And there's very little comment on it. There's very little comment from the gospel writers. There's very little comment until quite recently from biblical interpreters. The idea that we should all feel like we are enslaved to God, which turns God into a slave master. It's like, that's horrible to me.
Yeah.
So to wrestle with those parables, I find that very, very difficult. It's an important exercise, but it's a very difficult one. And these are cases where I'm wrestling with the text as well, because sometimes I just can't find something redemptory in that text. So the good news here is that we're now in a position where we realize how horrible this stuff is, and we can wrestle with it. Yeah. So rather than redeem the text, use the text as a prompt to say, how does this help me recognize human trafficking? Or how does this help me recognize people whose labor is not sufficiently compensated? How does this help me recognize people who act out of fear rather than out of love? Where is abuse happening here in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, in our own world? Those are the hard ones.
Yeah.
And I admit that when I first started looking at parables, it's like, it didn't occur to me that was a problem. And then reading the parable, sometimes called the parable of the prodigal son, parable of the man who had two sons. When the older brother hears noise, music and dancing coming from the house, he calls an enslaved person and said, what's going on? And the person says, oh, your brother came home and dad killed the fatted calf. And then a little bit later, when dad comes out to talk to the older brother, and the older brother says, listen, I've been working like a doulos. I've been working like a slave. And like, there's an enslaved person standing right there going, no, you haven't.
Right? Like, I know what it is.
Right. But until I became conscious about the depiction of enslaved people who are all over the place, I never noticed him. Just get past this verse by. And now I'm caught up short with it each time. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that might be a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, strangely enough, no depictions of that parable I've ever seen have the enslaved person look at the audience and roll their eyes, or it feels like there should be a laugh track at that moment at the older brother, but
or at least a sigh.
Yeah. Some sort of like, yeah.
Yeah, but then we're indicted, because if we laugh, then what? What does that say about us?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. You know what it's like to be a slave. I don't.
Yep.
Right.
I don't. What am I going to do for you now, fellow? Right.
Yeah.
And that's what parables do. They indict, and you can't get around it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that's brilliant on Jesus's part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about Muppets.
We will, but we have a couple scripture readings to run through first. But yes, we are certainly jumping toward the Muppets. Our first reading for this episode is from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. God offers King Solomon a gift, and Solomon asks for wisdom.
So one of the big themes in this passage is wisdom, right?
Yay.
And that is one of the things that Solomon is most known for. And as I was reading it this time, I kept thinking of Moana's grandmother in the movie Moana, and like the wisdom that she had in like her connection to the ocean. And she was just so wise and also a little goofy. And I love that, like, that wisdom doesn't have to be taken seriously. Like, it doesn't have to be a very serious, like, but that she can be both wise and the goofy elder in the community.
Yeah, I like that.
She's so fun.
The text really deconstructs. So, for all that Solomon is known for his wisdom, when the two sex workers, one of whom has a dead baby, one of whom has a live baby, and they present themselves to Solomon, and he's supposed to determine who the true mother is, and he says, "Bring me a sword." I don't think that's wise. What he's doing is he's putting this child at risk because you don't know what these two women are going to say. Right? And one of them says, "Fine, chop him in two." That doesn't strike me as wise. Solomon engages in forced labor, the corvée system, which is in part why, under his son, the empire breaks up. I don't think he's very wise at all. I think he's an indulged, overextended politician who got a good reputation. So for me, when Solomon gets, Solomon the wise and all that, I say, what kind of wisdom are we seeing here? And does the reputation actually fit the candidate? I'm careful here. Do we have actual wisdom, or are we getting a subversive thing? So that people who are reading the text with eyes of wisdom might see something a little bit more going on than, "Yay, Solomon, you're terrific."
Yeah. Well, and that's like in verse 6, Solomon says, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you, and you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today." And every time it's a similar thing. Every time David is lifted up as like righteous and good, and I'm like, Bathsheba, like.
Oh, more than that, allowing the sexual abuse of his daughter to go unresponded.
Sure.
Right? In his own household.
Yeah. But there's just like so much of the rewriting of history. But then I will admit I have not really challenged like the assumption that Solomon is wise. And so when you say that, then it's like, oh, this reading of this passage is completely different. To have Solomon say, completely mischaracterize David, and then ask for wisdom, and then it's supposedly given, but then also it's just like a series of like, who's making the definitions? Like, who's
right. Solomon was 700 wives and 300 concubines or something like that. That doesn't strike me as wisdom. That strikes me as overextension.
Yeah.
And in terms of David, he's not completely awful. So now we got another problem. So until COVID, I was working regularly teaching in a maximum security prison here in Nashville. And my insider students would repeat, "God forbid you would be known by the worst thing you've ever done."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fair.
So they're all problematic.
Yeah.
And none of them is really a role model, but none of them is not a role model either.
Yeah, yeah. Which then opens a lot more space for us as humans to be human.
Mm-hmm.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And then in verse 9 we read, "Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this your great people?" And whether or not like he actually makes use of the wisdom, I kind of like the idea of a leader asking for wisdom. Like, I guess I'm hoping the point here isn't that God tried to give Solomon wisdom and it didn't work, but that God would be able to give someone wisdom if they asked for it. And this makes me think about the difference in reputations between David and Solomon. And David is remembered as a great monarch who did enormous things for the kingdom. And Solomon is, like you said, mostly has a reputation for being wise. But, David is remembered for a lot of things, and certainly not just the worst thing he ever did, but like wise is not really a word I hear applied to him very often. That wasn't really the gift that he was focusing on. And a wise approach to decision making would be useful to a ruler. So I kind of wonder if Solomon, in this moment of asking for this, is he trying to break a generational cycle here by asking for wisdom? And it reminds me of the most recent book I read, where one person was taking over for the previous person in a monarchy, was The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. And when the unexpected youngest son inherits the throne because literally everyone else has died, he carefully chooses a regnal name that is not identical to or related to his now deceased estranged father, but instead chooses one from someone who had a long and peaceful reign 500 years before, in order to signal a change in leadership style. And this kind of reminds me of this. Is Solomon trying to start something new by asking for wisdom? Or, like you possibly implied, is this a story that Solomon tells about himself later on in order to give himself a certain reputation?
Or it's been controlled by a later editor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Archaeological evidence for Solomon is sorely lacking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is wonderful on the Bible's part. It's our judgment. Here's the reputation. Is it valid? What constitutes wisdom? Why is it that you have the idea of overthrowing wisdom in some texts? And Paul's not interested in wisdom, 1 Corinthians 1. Jesus as a child of wisdom, but I typically don't think of Jesus as so much a wisdom teacher, although parables are a form of wisdom literature. So even what do we mean by wisdom? Is wisdom something divine like Sophia or Chokmah in the Hebrew? Is wisdom something that you can cultivate, or is wisdom something that's innate, you get born with it or not? These are all interesting questions, and the text opens them up.
Yeah. Especially, I think of the beginning of John, too, of Jesus as the Word and that connection to wisdom. And yeah. And then our second reading for this episode is Romans chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. God, who has sent us the Holy Spirit and God's own Son, Jesus Christ, loves us so much that nothing can separate us from their love. And there's a 3-year-old in my life, and she recently was asking me, what is God? And we were having a video back and forth about what is God and what she thought. And she came up with, I guess they had read The Invisible String, which is a kid's picture book. And she came up with God's love as the invisible string, that it connects all of the people, and that there are ways that you can strengthen it, that you tug on it, but that it's always there connecting us. It's just invisible. And I really loved that imagery from a 3-year-old, unprompted by her. Her parents did not feed her that line. It was just this is what I think God is. I like that image with the Romans passage. And I love the Romans passage. And as we dive into the verses, in verse 26, we read, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And I use this verse in particular a fair amount, and I did a lot as a chaplain also, that idea of whether it's gentle parenting TikTok or anger release TikTok or any of those things, that the prayers that we pray don't have to have words, and they can be the deep sighs and grief, and they can be screaming into the void, and they can be all sorts of different things, and still there is this understanding from God, and that the Spirit helps interpret and receive those prayers that don't have words and don't have clear, explicit things.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a midrash about this little Jewish boy in the back of the synagogue who's just reciting the alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. And the rabbi comes over to him and says, why are you reciting the alphabet? And he says, because I don't know the prayer, so I'm just going to give God the letters and God will put the prayer together.
I love that.
I'm trusting on this.
That is so perfect. The prayer of an alphabet.
And then in verse 36 we read, as it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep to be slaughtered. Okay, so I cannot even begin to tell you how often I have heard this passage quoted without verse 36. Christians, and especially Lutherans, love verse 35 and verses 37 through 39, because those are the list of things that will not separate us from God's love. People love that passage. It's great. And then we continually skip verse 36, because in the middle we have this quotation from Psalm 44, verse 22, that kind of jumps out of the genre that we seem to be in into a slightly different genre, because it jumps from the list of things that can't separate us from God's love into this whole we are being killed all day long, which is quite the emotional shift. And looking at the Jewish annotated New Testament, beautifully edited by Dr. Levine and others, we see that Psalm 44 thanks God for having done great things for Israel's ancestors, and then claims that God is allowing bad things to happen to them now. They are being killed, sold, being laughed at, and so on. But they haven't given up their faith in God or turned their hearts from God, which is why they're being killed all day long. And they are suffering for God's sake. And so putting that in the middle of a list of things that don't separate them from God's love is a powerful witness. But it also does require some explanation for those who don't recognize the quote, and that's why we so often skip this verse when we read this passage.
Sure, it's a standard psalm of lament. Psalm 22 is probably the best known, my God, why have you forsaken me, in the Christian church. There are a bunch of them, and they're all formulaic. Things are really, really bad. How bad are they? Let me detail them. But you, God, you were faithful in the past, so we know we can do it again. You can do it again. Things are really bad, so you kind of draw on divine sympathy. How bad are they? We're being killed. But you know what? When you come through, and I'm sure you're going to come through, I will praise your name to the highest heaven. It's all formulaic. So Jews knew that when you engaged in a psalm of lament, whether it's this 44 or 64, 68, 22, so on, that you explain how bad things are. You don't have to hold back. You can be entirely honest about this. But as long as you're complaining to God, you're still in relationship. The one thing God doesn't want you to do is say, basically, the heck with you and walk away. So as long as you're complaining, you're still in relationship. You can rely on the past, and you can rely on divine fidelity, and you can rely on God who can take it. Right? You don't have to pull back when you're talking to God. So here's how bad I feel. Really, really bad. Things are horrible. My temple is destroyed. I'm in exile. Things are really, really bad. But I'm going to complain to you because I know you're going to listen to these complaints and you're going to come through with it. Yeah. So for Paul, who's writing to Gentiles, Paul's not writing to Jews. But the only Bible his friends in Rome have is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Scripture of Israel. They know how these Psalms end. It's not a singular verse. You read on. I had a professor in graduate school who's a Catholic priest who said that 139 was his favorite psalm because it's the one psalm where people are saying exactly what they feel in total and raw honesty. But like the story of the rape of Dinah in chapter 34 of Genesis, or the Levite's concubine in Judges 19, or the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel, that these stories are designed to evoke from us reactions of horror. That's how bad it is. And then you pull back and you go, I can't imagine I even said that. And you get it out of your system and you recoil with the horror that you could even think such thought. And you move on. And he said for him, that was the epitome of raw honesty. And he's horrified by it, but he appreciates that it's there because it acknowledges those horrible emotions of which all humanity is capable.
Yeah, I like that.
And then our final reading for this episode is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33 and 44 through 52. Jesus describes the reign of God in several short parables.
So one of the themes that I noticed in the parables before we just went through all of them was this idea of preciousness, and thinking particularly of the pearl of great price and the preciousness of that pearl for the merchant. And I think there are a lot of different ways that we find things precious that are not necessarily valuable. And like, I think of the cake platter prize of the Great British Baking Show, where like whoever's the best, like you get a cake plate to display your cake on that says Great British Baking Show. But also the other day, there was like a meme or something that somebody was like, a potato is worth more than gold. And somebody else was like, that makes no sense. But a potato is always worth a potato. It will always feed you a potato's worth of nutrients. And gold, if you're out starving somewhere, will not do anything for you. It's only worth what we say it is worth. And so I really like that space of like, what do we actually call precious? What do we actually consider to be of great value and great worth? Because it's not necessarily the things that in a capitalist sense or in a commerce sense are the valuable things.
Yeah.
And then as we dive into the verses, we already dived into the verses once, but as I mentioned before, for verse 33 and Jesus' parable, the kingdom of heaven, the realm of heaven, is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Until I read some of what you have written, AJ, I didn't quite get it. And now, like, as I was thinking about it, I'm also in like, partly in like Star Wars mode for the other podcast that I co-host. And so I was like thinking about the Death Star, but like kind of the opposite. It feels so like over the top, the amount of bread and of dough that is created in 3 measures of flour. It just feels like so much and so over the top. And the Death Star is a similar thing. It is so over the top to kill people and planets, but as opposed to like creating bread that feeds people. But it's that like over the top nature that just like feels so much bigger and more beyond than what I could like conceive of as my like one little human being on planet Earth.
Fits in with the mustard seed, with the birds of heaven nesting in its branches, or it's something that starts so tiny but can wind up accomplishing so much if given time for itself, if given appropriate nutrients, if given appropriate starting point. That all makes sense.
Yeah.
And the result is all over everybody. The result is everybody gets lunch. That's a good goal.
Yeah.
I'm a fan.
As long as they're not gluten intolerant. And then in verse 44, we read, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. And then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." Okay, so possibly showing my own bias here that this goes against every piece of financial advice that my entire family has ever given me. Diversify, diversify, diversify. But this is very much putting all of your eggs in one basket. If you win, great. If you lose, you are so much worse off than you've ever been for such a long time. And it made me think of the Doctor Who 2-parter at the end of the season of Christopher Eccleston being the Doctor. The 2 episodes were Bad Wolf and Parting of the Ways, that include a futuristic game show where the contestants who lost did not just go home with nothing, but instead were actually killed and turned into Daleks, as it turned out. That was one of the big reveals for those episodes. And yeah, I don't know what to do with this concept of the kingdom of heaven being like a fairly terrible piece of advice. Like, on the one hand, if there is one thing that you can truly bet on against everything else, I would certainly hope it would be God. But on the other hand, in every other aspect of your life, this is going to do terrible things to you. It feels odd.
I don't see what you've lost here. And I'm not even sure it's all that much risk taking. I mean, you know where that treasure is. You've got your eye on it. You know what the market's going to bear.
As long as no one else knows that it's there and can go and steal it.
That's right, but you can keep your eye on it. And you know what the market is. And you know that nobody else has found it. And you move quickly. And you strike when you can. So I don't think there's a huge amount of risk here. So let's say you don't get the field. You still have your liquidated assets. You can use them for something else.
Interesting.
I think it's clever. I'm not sure it's moral, but it's legal. And that's another part where parables get you. The dishonest steward is another really good example of this. Might be legal, but I'm not sure it was moral. And then at what point do you start saying, well, but was this the right thing to do? And you say, well, was the person poor to begin with? Was the person rich who's getting cheated? Where did the original money come from? Is it a good thing that the family can't recuperate it because they were awful people? Whatever.
Yeah.
And then let the parable work.
I guess the implication for this parable is that not only do you have to have all of these things that you can sell to buy the field, but also you have to have another person who you can trust who will keep an eye on the field while you go and buy it, because probably you can't buy it while also being able to keep an eye on the field.
Right. Or for the young adult who has this great dream, I really want to go to art school. I really want to go on an archaeological dig, or I really want to set up a nonprofit, but I need $50,000 in order to do it. And I'll give you everything that I've got. And, the parents come in or the friends come in and they crowdsource it. It strikes me as not dissimilar here. How do you follow your dream? And sometimes you got to put everything in there. And you know what? If it doesn't work, because sometimes it doesn't, no, you're not going to be like the next Hollywood star. You're not going to be the next NBA forward, right? Because you're only 4'2". But go for your dream and see if you can manage that. And the idea that somebody can actually find that dream, how fabulous that is.
Yeah.
But you've got the rest of the gospel to guide you.
Sure.
Yeah. And now for our most storied parabolic segment, let's make a Muppets musical. So this is the space in our episode where we cast a Muppets musical, where we pick who would be a token human or which Muppets characters we would cast if we were making any of these passages or any passage writ large into a Muppets musical. This is inspired by a conversation that Kay had with Rabbi Danya Rutenberg on Twitter a year and a half ago, maybe?
Something like that.
About turning the Bible stories into Muppets musicals. And so we have had fun doing that since then. AJ, do you have any Muppets that you think would be great at maybe illustrating a parable or...
I tend not to think of Muppets as illustrating parables. Muppets have their own role in my life, or they did when my children were little, because both of my kids grew up with Sesame Street and then the Israeli version, Rehov Simpson. But I have a fondness for Fozzie Bear because he's sweet and he's not a child, so he's not like Elmo-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of does his own thing and he laughs at his own jokes, and I appreciate that. So I would not mind seeing Fozzie Bear characterized as the merchant in search of a pearl, because he can find it and then he can count up how many pearls he has, and I think that would be cool. And he strikes me as like an harsh-built comedian, so I think he could be that kind of wisdom with a funny edge to it. So I'm sticking with Fozzie Bear.
Yeah, I like that. Kay, did you have...
Well, oddly enough, I was trying to think not so much of which Muppet would tell parables, because that's not really a Muppety thing on the whole, but which Muppet would be like the best audience member for a person telling parables. And oddly enough, I also landed on Fozzie Bear, because the thing about Fozzie is not only is he a wonderful performer, but he also knows how to be a good audience member. He shows appreciation, and he genuinely cares that the person is putting forth effort to entertain him. And with a parable, I think he would actually put in the effort to try to puzzle it out and be willing to have the conversation. And he is also good at listening to others. So I think Fozzie Bear would be an excellent audience member. Yeah. How about you, Emily?
Makes sense. So I'm still stuck on the woman and the yeast and the bread. And the most obvious go-to for that is the Swedish chef, obviously, because the Swedish chef is the one that cooks and bakes. But I also, now that I say it, am wondering about Camilla as the woman that, like, Camilla could totally just, like, poke her beak in. Yeah. Could just, like, poke her beak in and, like, plant the yeast as the Swedish chef maybe is, like, just messing around with all of the 3 measures, the 60 pounds of flour, and then, like, watch it slowly incorporate into everything. So I think that's how I'm casting this time.
Everything the Swedish chef makes turns into a disaster, but Camilla could also be in the corner successfully making a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So, AJ, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Yeah, just go read the Bible and ask questions of it and wrestle with it, and you will be likely entertained and informed. And if some sort of spirituality comes along with it, so much the better. But you'll be entertained and informed, and that's not a bad way of functioning.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you just finished a new book?
The newest book that's coming out, which is coming out in 2 weeks from Abingdon, is on the Gospel of Mark, called Beginner's Guide to the Good News. And that's designed for basically congregational-based Bible study, because it comes with a leader's guide and a video in case you don't want to read. And there's a bigger book coming up from Harper called Jesus for Everyone, which was originally called Jesus for Atheists. And I thought, no, I just want to talk to people who are actually believers. Something here too.
Yeah.
To say that you don't have to be a theist in order to appreciate some of these stories. And that's where I get to wrestle with things like the parables regarding enslavement and Jesus and gender and Jesus and sexuality and Jesus and economics and so on. And I get to look at a bunch of parables that I didn't look at in the short stories.
Nice. But we'll try and link to those in our episode description for folks so that if they are interested, they can find them. And we will link to Short Stories by Jesus, because I think everyone should own that book and read that book. Thank you so much for being on our podcast and for
Absolutely.
More wisdom than Solomon had.
It's not saying that much.
It's not, but it's saying something.
Yeah.
Definitely viewers are.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us. This has been a
Absolutely.
fantastic episode. And thank you for joining us, dear listeners, our nerdlings. I know, I'm still going to try and get our listeners to be called nerdlings because I think it's cute. Anyway, catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing, and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than becoming a gemologist and learning how to evaluate pearls for their price.
Yes, it is. It's cheaper than becoming an expert in just about anything, in fact. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.
Et vobiscum pax.